My name is Caleb Mercer. I'm 33 years old, and 6 months ago, I walked out of a family dinner so quiet, it felt like the loudest thing I've ever done. Logan got $1 million check. I got a reminder to stay in my lane. The applause that night was polite, but pointed. The smiles? Rehearsed. And my father? Douglas Mercer sat at the head of the table, lifting his glass with that familiar look. The same one I've seen for years. Part amusement, part disappointment, and all calculation. For Logan, there were speeches. For me, there was silence. That kind of silence that doesn't just fill the room, it defines your place inside it. But what they didn't know was that while they were passing around checks and legacy titles, I'd been building something else. Quietly, relentlessly, away from their dinner tables and away from their expectations. And when my grandfather, Walter Hargrove, asked me to meet him at the cabin the next day, I thought it would be a conversation. I didn't realize it was a turning point. Before I tell you how a single envelope changed the entire balance of power in the Mercer family, before I show you how I went from background noise to the deciding vote at the next board meeting, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments, and if you've ever been underestimated by your own family, if you've ever swallowed your voice just to keep the peace, or sat at a table where your worth felt invisible, stay with me. Because this story, it's not just mine. It's yours too. The applause was brief but pointed, just enough to sound polite without becoming emotional. The mahogany table stretched endlessly between us all, a polished river of expectations and family pride. At the head, my father raised his glass with that familiar glint in his eye, the kind that never landed on me for long. Logan was glowing. Even the chandelier seemed to highlight him more generously than anyone else at the table, throwing golden warmth onto his pressed navy suit and the pristine document folder now open in front of him. $1 million, Douglas said with a proud chuckle, lifting the check between two fingers as if it were light as air. Because I believe in vision. And you, Logan, you've got it. Cousins clinked glasses. Someone at the far end murmured, "Incredible." And Mom offered a small, rehearsed smile, eyes darting to mine only briefly before falling to her plate. I swallowed hard and glanced out the frost-dusted windows. The pine trees beyond the glass were swaying gently, tips trembling in the evening wind. Just like I had trembled 5 years ago, the night Grandpa Walter pulled me aside and said, "The day you stop proving yourself to them is the day you'll begin living." But here I was again. "I'd like to share something too," I began, placing my hand on the old leather notebook resting by my plate. The room didn't fall silent. It deflated. Chairs creaked slightly as people shifted, and my father's eyes sharpened. "Caleb," he said. His tone dipped in that dry patience only he could weaponize. "Let's not turn dinner into a Shark Tank." The silence that followed was louder than any argument. I pulled my hand back, slowly, as if retracting a mistake. My breath caught in my throat while Logan reached for his wine with a smirk I knew too well. "Some people just aren't wired for business, I guess," he said casually, as if he hadn't rehearsed that line in his head for days. Laughter followed. Some tight, some polite, some genuine. I couldn't tell which was worse. Walter sat 3 seats down, angled just slightly so he could see me without turning his head. He wasn't laughing. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something. A spark, a warning, maybe an invitation. I took another sip of water. The glass trembled slightly against the crystal stem, the vibrations running up my fingers. I told myself to stay calm, stay silent, stay composed. But the food, untouched on my plate, tasted like cardboard in my mouth. Eventually, Logan launched into a monologue about scalability and digital pipelines, buzzwords that filled the air like smoke. The rest of the table leaned in with varying degrees of interest. I kept my eyes on my notebook, running my thumb along its frayed edge. Inside were sketches, product flowcharts, algorithms, pieces of something I'd been building, refining, quietly breathing life into for 2 years. No one had ever asked to see it. I looked up again. Mom caught my gaze and offered a sympathetic smile, as if to say, "That's just how your father is." Then she turned away and nodded along to Logan's future plans. Dessert was announced. I stood before the plates were cleared. "Excuse me," I said softly. Douglas looked annoyed. "Dinner's not over." "It is for me." Chairs scraped. Someone gasped a little. Walter, however, didn't flinch. As I passed behind his chair, he said, just loud enough for me to hear, "Come by the cabin tomorrow." "Just you?" I paused for a second, didn't look at him, then kept walking. The air outside slapped me with a kind of clarity that only cold air can deliver. The trees stood darker now, whispering things I couldn't quite decipher. What does Grandpa want? And why only me? It was just me, Grandpa, and the wind rustling through a forest that hadn't changed in 50 years. The snow under my boots crunched with every step, soft and slow like it was trying not to wake something ancient. Pines stretched skyward around us, tall and indifferent, their green needles still clinging to branches despite the cold. The path to the cabin wound like a memory I hadn't visited in years, but somehow my body remembered the turns even before I saw them. Walter walked ahead of me, his shoulders hunched slightly under his old canvas coat. He didn't speak at first. He never did unless he meant it. "The tree's here," he finally said, pausing to tap one with the back of his glove. "Your father used to come out here too, before ambition made him deaf." The breeze swept through just then, catching his words and flinging them into the woods. I let them settle in my chest without replying. The cabin appeared between two hillocks, as if it had grown out of the land itself. Its porch was crooked but proud, the windows smudged but glowing with a kind of quiet wisdom. Inside, everything smelled of cedar and coffee. Thick, comforting. Walter motioned to the stone fireplace and handed me a bundle of logs. "Stack them right. Let the flame breathe." As I knelt down, arranging the logs like he taught me when I was 8, I could feel his gaze on me. Not with scrutiny, but with expectation. "Sit," he said once the fire caught. Then he pulled out a battered wooden box from beneath the old writing desk. Inside was a ledger, a few newspaper clippings, and something wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the table with a reverence I hadn't seen since Grandpa Hargrove read scriptures aloud on Sunday mornings. $10,000, he said, sliding a yellowing envelope across the table. "All yours, paper only. 5 years, no tech. This is your simulation." I blinked. "You're giving me an investment test?" "I'm giving you a question," he corrected. "What would you build? Not just grow. What endures?" I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a check, not yet dated. Beside it, a blank portfolio sheet with columns for sectors, strategy, ethics notes. I leaned back, thinking. Tech was out. No AI, no apps, no crypto. "Water," I said after a long pause. "Water infrastructure in drought zones. And maybe logistics. Green freight corridors." Walter didn't react, didn't praise. He just took out a pen, scribbled my choices in the ledger, and nodded. "Now tell me why." We spoke for over an hour. About investment, yes, but more than that. About the rot beneath short-term wins, about what happens when money becomes louder than values. Walter listened more than he talked, but when he did speak, it was like laying stones into a foundation. "You're not like your father," he finally said. "You remember what matters. Keep the fireplace burning when I'm gone." The fire popped softly then, as if answering. He stood and walked to a drawer near the window, pulling out a small envelope. It was sealed with a waxy smudge and tied with a pine needle green ribbon. He handed it to me slowly. "Don't open this until after I'm gone." I didn't ask questions, just took it. The way you take a torch from someone who won't be around to carry it much longer. Later, after dinner, just the two of us and some reheated stew, I sat on the edge of the guest bed and untied the ribbon, even though something in my chest twisted as I did. Inside was a folded paper, yellowed at the edges. On it, a handwritten list of obscure company names, strange acronyms I didn't recognize, and beside each a pair of initials. At the bottom, a small sketch of a pine tree. I traced the drawing with my finger. It was rough but purposeful, and beneath the roots, almost invisible, were the faint initials WH. What was he building? And why include me now? The news came as quietly as he lived. Walter Hargrove had passed away in his sleep. There was no fanfare. Just a voicemail from Alan Whitaker, Walter's attorney, delivered with the sort of clipped formality that hinted at emotion only in its absence. I played it 3 times, sitting on the edge of my bed in the pre-dawn dark. By the 4th, I stopped trying to understand why the world hadn't cracked in half to mark the loss. I drove north that morning in silence, past melting snowbanks and half-thawed fields. The trees remembered what I couldn't say. They stood in still witness as I pulled up to the cabin, now quiet in a way that made my chest tighten. The porch creaked beneath my boots as if it knew it would never hold his weight again. Inside, the fire had long gone cold, but the space felt strangely intact. His coffee mug was still on the table, a single pine needle floating in the water left inside. The air smelled like dust and cedar and something final. Then I saw it. On the mantel. A letter, folded and weighted down with a carved wooden plaque, shaped like a pine tree. Beside it lay the leather notebook he always carried but never let anyone open. I picked up the letter first. My name was written in tight cursive, slightly smudged like he'd hesitated before sealing it. Caleb, you listened when others didn't. That's all I ever wanted. You saw beyond the noise. I'm not leaving you riches. I'm leaving you questions, and the tools to answer them. Use your judgment. The Mercer name may be theirs, but its future doesn't have to be. Walter. My fingers trembled as I turned to the notebook. It was worn smooth by time. Inside were rows and rows of entries. Dates, stock names, handwritten evaluations of CEOs and industries. His handwriting curved and sharp, annotated with personal notes. Over-leveraged. Ego-driven. Promising but blind to long-term risk. Then, near the middle, I saw my own name. Caleb Mercer. Watch closely. Pattern of patience. Underestimated. I closed the notebook and just sat there. Hours passed. Maybe minutes. The shadows stretched until the windows went dark. Alan Whitaker's call came the next morning. You'll want to be here for the reading, he said. Walter made very specific arrangements. The Whitaker legal office stood nestled in the quiet end of downtown Minneapolis, its marble floor too polished for the gravity in the room. I entered to find Logan already seated, one leg crossed, phone in hand, and Douglas beside him, face unreadable. Marianne looked smaller somehow, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Alan greeted us with the solemn air of someone used to guiding people through landmines wrapped in paperwork. He opened the will. To Logan Mercer, he read, Walter leaves a gesture of thanks, a vintage set of golf clubs and his grandfather's wristwatch. Logan blinked, then shifted in his seat. To Douglas Mercer, the honor of legacy and no financial stake. Douglas's lips thinned, but he said nothing. Then Alan looked up. To Caleb Mercer. The room chilled. Walter leaves $5 million in liquid assets and 15% of voting stock in Mercer Holdings. I didn't move. I couldn't. Alan continued. Per Walter's direction, the stock has already transferred into an independent trust under Caleb's name, effective immediately. Silence fell like a dropped stone. Douglas turned slowly to face me, the weight of decades behind his gaze. We'll be contesting that, he said, voice as sharp as broken glass. I stood, but didn't respond. Marianne started to say something, her voice soft, wavering, but I couldn't meet her eyes. I walked out before she could finish a word. Outside, the wind was sharp and wet with sleet. I reached into my coat and pulled out the pine plaque, its edges worn smooth by years of touch. I held it tight, letting its weight center me. Walter had planted something, not just wealth, a challenge. And now, I was holding it. When the will was read, my father's face turned from confusion to fury. Not grief, not loss, just threat. We were back on the 19th floor of Whitaker Legal Group, surrounded by panoramic glass that let the cold April sky leak into the room. Even the city below looked frozen. Inside, it felt colder still. Silent, tense, brittle as glassware seconds before a crack. Alan Whitaker adjusted his cufflinks, as composed as ever. To reiterate, he said, looking directly at my father, Walter Hargrove amassed a 15% share of Mercer Holdings over 15 years. This was done privately, legally, and without interference from the board. Douglas shifted in his chair. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. His gaze dropped for a moment, uncharacteristic, and then lifted, full of a fury too slow to be righteous. He leaned forward, voice low and clipped. This is absurd. Walter didn't even attend board meetings. He didn't understand what Mercer Holdings is today. Alan raised an eyebrow. Perhaps he understood it better than you realized. I sat still, notebook in hand, but unopened. I hadn't said a word yet. The longer I stayed silent, the more they filled the space for me. Walter had once said, "A man's silence is never neutral. It either hides humility or war." I wasn't sure which one mine was anymore. Logan snapped first. "This is a stunt," he hissed, his voice trembling with barely restrained indignation. He didn't even believe in Caleb. He never once praised him. You think this is legacy? No, this was pity. It's charity, nothing more. I looked at him then. Really looked. The way his lip curled, the way he gripped the edge of the conference table as if it might float away. Underneath the swagger was something else entirely. Panic. "I don't need your belief," I said calmly, my voice even. "I have a vote now." The silence after that was absolute. Douglas stood, slowly, measured. This will not stand. We will be contesting the will under grounds of undue influence. He gestured toward me like I was a stain. You manipulated a sick old man. Before Alan could respond, Marianne finally broke. "Stop it," she said, the word barely audible but cutting like broken porcelain. Walter told me, months ago, I thought he was being sentimental, but he was serious. He said Caleb was the only one who ever listened. Her voice cracked. Logan turned to her, wide-eyed. "You knew?" She didn't answer. Alan calmly reached for a folder, then slid it across the table toward me. "Next board vote is in June," he said. "You'll need to prepare." The folder felt heavier than it looked. I didn't open it. Douglas let out a bitter laugh, short and hollow. "This isn't over." "No," I said. "It's just beginning." A few hours later, my phone buzzed. A private family meeting had been scheduled. I declined the invitation without opening the message. That night, I drove back north. The cemetery was quiet. An hour past closing, but no one stopped me. The gate creaked when I pushed it open, and the wind picked up as I walked between rows of familiar names. Walter's grave sat beneath an old pine, the headstone simple and unpolished, just like he'd want it. I didn't speak, didn't kneel. Just stood there, the pine plaque in my coat pocket, warm from my grip. I was no longer proving myself to them, and I wasn't walking away. The first time Logan called me in years, and it wasn't to apologize. It was big. I let the phone buzz 4 times before answering. Not out of spite, though God knows I had reasons, but because I knew whoever he used to be, that version of Logan Mercer wouldn't have called me unless something had collapsed. "Caleb," he said, voice clipped, urgent. "I need a minute. Please." Just like that. "Please." I leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes wander across the blank walls of my office. Twin Pines Inc. had no family photos, no legacy trinkets, just plans, charts, and quiet. Go ahead, I said, pretending I hadn't already guessed. He inhaled sharply, like he was swallowing his pride one shard at a time. Echelon Capital just pulled out of the Series A. I didn't move. That's the $4 million round, right? Yeah. I don't have backup. They said something about due diligence inconsistencies. Look, I just need someone to talk to them. Or vouch. You know the space. You're solid. They'd listen to you. I said nothing. Logan cleared his throat. I know we haven't exactly. This isn't about us. This is business. I almost laughed. Business. I'll look into it, I said coolly. Don't call Echelon again. I'll send someone. He didn't say thank you, just hung up. I buzzed Jordan within 5 minutes. Need you to take a look at Logan's company. Full audit. Financials, vendors, press history. If it breathes, flag it. Jordan raised an eyebrow. Want the truth or the spin? The rot, I said. Always the rot. 2 days later, he came back with a folder thick enough to crack a desk. Where do I start? He said, almost impressed. Logan's pitch deck said 22% growth. The real number? -6. Vendors are pulling out due to unpaid invoices. He leveraged Mercer's name for bridge loans he's missed payments on. Oh, and someone anonymous just scrubbed his LinkedIn. I flipped through the pages slowly. Fabricated graphs, ghost partnerships. One particularly bold claim about a non-existent pilot program with an energy company in Arizona. He's cooked, I muttered. Jordan nodded. You want to bury him or bail him? I didn't answer. Instead, I drove across the river to meet Logan at a cafe we both used to like when things were simpler, before our lives diverged into resentment and performance metrics. He looked worse than I expected. The tie was sharp, but his eyes were bloodshot and darting. He'd lost weight, or maybe just the arrogance that once padded every room he entered. You didn't have to come in person, he said. I know. I ordered a black coffee and let silence stretch long enough for him to fidget. You burned your investors, I said quietly, the same way Dad burned his sons. He flinched, hard. I didn't mean to. Things moved too fast. You lied, I interrupted. And not even well. He ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. Look, if you don't help me, I go under. That tanks the family name, too. I sipped the coffee. It was bitter and perfect. Maybe it's time it did. His jaw clenched, but there was no comeback. Just a slow, stunned nod, like he'd finally met the part of me he never thought I had. I left him sitting there. Back at the office, Jordan handed me another file. Found something interesting, he said. Your father's listed as an executive guarantor on one of Logan's bridge loans. If Logan defaults, Douglas takes the hit. I raised an eyebrow. Walter's last envelope had said, the day they return will be the day they need, not love, you. It wasn't about pride anymore. 6 months later, I walked into a ballroom of 500 investors, and no one knew I carried a forest's worth of ghosts. The chandeliers glowed like softened stars overhead, and the marble floors echoed with the low hum of clinking glasses and hushed speculation. 4 seasons, Minneapolis. A launch event tailored for spectacle. Everyone dressed like they were auditioning for the future. I didn't smile. I didn't scan the crowd for familiar faces. I knew who wouldn't be there. Instead, I nodded to Jordan, who stood just beyond the front row and stepped onto the stage. The murmurs fell. 100 phones lifted, ready to catch whatever I would say. Some expected the pitch of the year. Others, a redemption arc. They would get neither. Walter had told me once, don't raise your voice, raise your worth. Tonight, I would do both. I gripped the edge of the podium, looked straight into the mass of glimmering eyes, and began. When Walter Hargrove handed me a sealed envelope earlier this year, I didn't know what it meant. He didn't leave a manual, a checklist, or a pat on the back. What he left was a mirror and a challenge. Somewhere near the center, I caught a flicker of silver hair on a man who looked like Douglas. He wasn't invited, but the press feed was live, and I had no doubt he was watching. I grew up in a family where performance mattered more than purpose, where market share mattered more than relationships. Tonight, that ends. A subtle shift rolled through the room, the kind that says, he's not just here to pitch. Hargrove Ventures will not chase quarterly illusions. We are not here for the next big noise. We are here for the next 50 years. For clean water, for logistics that work, for companies that don't burn trust to generate returns. Applause broke. Not thunderous, but firm. Believing. I continued. Legacy is not what we leave behind. Legacy is what moves forward without us. Silence again, and this time it stayed. After the speech, cameras swarmed. I posed, but barely. I shook hands, but made no promises. Jordan whispered, "We did it." "No," I said, glancing toward the far wall. "He did it." I walked out before the final toast and headed for the boardroom 2 floors up. It was smaller than the ballroom, wood-paneled, warmer, more real. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the pine plaque, the same one that had rested on Walter's mantle. The wood was old, darkened from touch. The carving was simple. One tree, its roots exposed. I hung it on the far wall, just above the glass panel overlooking the skyline. Walter's final note was folded in my inside pocket. I unfolded it slowly, fingers brushing across the aging fibers, and read the last line aloud. Soft, but clear. The only empire worth building is one that lasts without you. I let the words hang. Then I pulled out my phone. One unsent message had waited there for weeks, maybe longer. I hit send. You don't owe me. You owe the truth to yourself. It went to Logan. No response expected. None needed. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft and slow like the first time. I walked through it alone. No coat, just breath visible in the wind. My footsteps left brief impressions before the flakes filled them in. Somewhere beneath the surface, pine trees were still growing. Unseen, steady. And finally, mine. 6 months. That's how long it took for the world to finally see me. Not as an echo in my father's shadow, not as the cautionary footnote next to Logan's headlines, but as myself. Sometimes I wonder if Walter knew exactly how it would unfold, or if he simply trusted the forest more than the noise. Maybe he believed in growth the way pines do. Slow, quiet, invisible until it breaks the surface and becomes undeniable. Either way, he gave me time. And time, when used with intention, becomes the sharpest tool. The morning after the launch, I sat alone in the boardroom, just me and the pine plaque. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the sky was bruised with that soft blue that always comes right before. A different kind of silence filled the air. Not the silence of dismissal I'd grown up with. Not the kind that said, you don't belong here. This was earned quiet. The kind that follows a choice made and carried through. I thought about Logan's face when I didn't answer his last call. About my father, still clinging to a name while the legacy slipped through his fingers. About Marianne, who once said nothing mattered more than keeping the peace, and now had to live with what peace cost. And I thought about Walter, about how he never tried to rescue me from them, only from the need for their approval. The real test was never the stock list, the inheritance, or even the boardroom vote. The real test was, would I keep burning for their love, or would I finally stop handing them the match? That morning, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I just felt free. I stood, adjusted my cufflinks, and ran a fingertip across the wood grain of the pine carving, the roots, the branches, the years. Then I walked out, letting the door close behind me without a sound. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives in stillness, in a closed door, a missing seat at the table, or a name reclaimed after years of silence. Caleb Mercer didn't strike back with fire. He outlasted them with purpose. He proved that legacy isn't who remembers your name, but what they can no longer deny. Like pine trees pushing through frost, the truth may take time, but it never fails to rise. And when courage meets betrayal with clarity instead of bitterness, the ones who tried to bury you often end up beneath the weight of their own lies. Because in the end, no empire built on exclusion can stand against the quiet permanence of justice. So, if you've ever been told to know your place, if you've ever been handed silence when you deserved a seat at the table, or watched your hard work get reduced to a joke at a family dinner, I hope this story stayed with you. Because here's what I learned after years of sitting at that long mahogany table, pretending I was okay with being invisible. You don't need their checks to build your worth. You don't need their applause to validate your work. And you definitely don't need their approval to outgrow the space they tried to trap you in. What you need is clarity, receipts, and a spine that doesn't shake, no matter how many eyes are watching when you finally stand up. Walter didn't leave me money just to make a point. He left me a choice, to keep proving myself to people who were never going to see me, or to build something that made their opinions irrelevant. I chose the second one. And if you're watching this right now, feeling like you're still waiting for someone to hand you your moment, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the sign you've been waiting for. You don't need an invitation. You don't need their timeline. You just need one decision, your own. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, not just to the big moments, but to the small silences in between, for making space here, for stories like mine and maybe stories like yours. If this video resonated with you, if you've ever had to outgrow the people who underestimated you, or if you're still somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, drop a comment below. Tell me, what's the boundary you're drawing next? What's the silence you're finally done accepting? What's the first step you're taking for you and only you? And if you want to hear more stories like this, about family, about reclaiming power, about building something real when no one believed you could, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because legacy, it's not something they give you. It's something you build. One choice, one step, one quiet but undeniable victory at a time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.